Israel's assassination of the suspected terrorist responsible for the missile attack on Eilat in Gaza is the first fatal attack since November's ceasefire between Israel and Hamas-led Gaza. It is widely seen as a warning shot to Hamas by Israel to get their affairs in order. It's almost 6 months since Pillar of Defense redefined the relationship between Israel and Hamas. No one in Israel believed it will last, but the Middle East, as always, is full of surprises. So we convinced two of our experts to give us their insider's looks of how this very unlikely ceasefire feels like to them.
In the Middle East, everything can happen, and miscalculation, or Hamas will be forced to retaliate. But all in all, I think that the basic interest of both Hamas and Israel, also of Egypt, is to continue with the ceasefire agreement, to keep the border quiet. It's good for Israel, but it's also good for not only for Egypt, but for Hamas, because it's the future and the survival of the Hamas government in Gaza. So it is in their interest to keep the border quiet and to avoid any retaliation. And I guess that since it is in the interest of all sides to maintain the ceasefire agreement, to keep the border quiet, some understandings will be reached, I guess.
I think that the basic interest of Hamas to keep the situation stable and quiet is still strong. However, there are other forces in the Gaza Strip, smaller groups, maybe mainly the Salafist jihadist groups, that have different interests, exactly the opposite interest, and they try to drag the two parties, Hamas and Israel, to a new conflict. That creates a very fragile situation in which there is a real risk of escalation that eventually will lead to a conflict because of a chain of reactions and counter-reactions. So I think that the two sides have to be very cautious and behave in a clever way to prevent actually doing what these small groups want them to do.
Hamas had to redefine itself, especially towards its supporters in Gaza.
For many years, Hamas considered itself as a resistant movement, resisting Israel, fighting Israel. Now they are part of a ceasefire agreement. They keep the border quiet. They're protecting Israel. What they are going to say to the Palestinian public opinion? How can they come to their former allies and say, well, now you should stop resisting Israel? It's very difficult from the point of view of the Hamas. That's why they were reluctant to do so, and I guess they will understand that in order to ensure the survival of the Hamas government in Gaza, they will have to do it eventually.
Actually, there is an internal debate within Hamas between those like the one that was actually elected as their leader recently, Khaled Mashal, that wishes actually to make a real turn in the policies of Hamas and in some way to cause Hamas join the political process with Israel, put more emphasis on political power than in use of military means, and others that are mostly concentrated in Gaza itself that don't want it because they think it will hurt their interests.
But where our experts differ completely on their analysis is about Egypt's involvement in the whole Gaza situation.
I think that the problem with Egypt is not that Egypt is part of a conspiracy, but Egyptian, President Morsi has very little control over what is happening outside his palace. Not to speak about Greater Cairo, not to speak about Sinai. So you want him to follow closely events along the Israeli or the Gaza-Sinai border. I don't think this is in the interest of Egypt. Escalation is not in the interest of Egypt, but we know the situation is in Egypt is that lack of stability, chaos, and not too effective and strong government in Cairo. So it will take time, and unfortunately, what we have seen under Mubarak, we see under Morsi the lack of ability of the Egyptian security forces to prevent the smuggling of weapons into Gaza.
One of the paradoxes of the current situation is that I think the level of security cooperation with Egypt now is better than it was ever under the government of the Muslim Brotherhood. And there are several achievements. I think that the Egyptians are more effective in the way that they deal with the smuggling. From our point of view, not effective enough, but more effective than they used to be.
The question a lot of people in Israel are asking is how come, if Hamas is not firing those missiles towards the southern Israeli cities, how do those tiny little militia groups get their ammunitions?
I don't think that the Salafist jihadists are getting info from the Hamas because Hamas consider them a threat. And there were already incidents in which Hamas killed some of these persons. The Hamas, and the issue is not only the relationship with Israel. Hamas is very concerned of the possibility that these groups will cause him trouble in the relationship with Egypt. Let me remind you the incident in which one of these groups killed the 16 Egyptian soldiers, which poisoned the relations between the Hamas government and Sinai and Egypt until this day, actually. But on the other hand, Hamas and in general Palestinian governments, that was also true for Fatah government in the past, are very reluctant of fighting their own people, of a scenario of civil war. And Hamas is playing between these two things. And one of the purposes of Israel's reaction should be to present more forcefully the risk of escalation, and by that motivate Hamas to do what they should do. Of course, then the problem is that you may also play it too forcefully, and then you create the escalation that you don't want.
It seems that both Israel and Hamas have a strong interest to keep the ceasefire agreement intact, even though the Hamas has a tougher time explaining why they want peace with Israel to their supporters who grew up knowing the Jewish state as the greatest evil there is. For JN1, I'm Jacobsohn in Tel Aviv.